The amount of times I've heard the Linux is a dead platform argument is truly staggering. If I had made a list, then I'd be here all day talking about all of the articles one by one and telling them that they're wrong in incredibly technical sounding words. And it's not just by some random bloggers either. Actual newspapers and fairly respectable news sites seem to always point their reticle on Linux and go out their way to prove how immensely stupid Linux is as an operating system, be it for gaming or for use in daily life or even as a server. Are we really that resistant to change that I have to defend a perfectly fine operating system now? We have, haven't we? Let's talk about it. For a start, let me begin by asking such an obvious rhetorical question. If Linux was such a dead platform, why are there high-profile game releases for it then? For example, and this is not an exhaustive list, Rocket League is slated for a Linux release any day now, Payday 2 just released on Linux at the end of March, and Tomb Raider 2013 is said to be releasing at some point in the spring. So it's pretty obvious that, and I'm only going to say this once from now on, the Linux family, SteamOS, Linux Mint, Ubuntu, Arch, Debian, whatever Linux OS distro you prefer, they are not dead. They are very much alive, and they're becoming more and more relevant for a number of different reasons, notably for gaming, which is what I'll be talking most about. First, contrary to popular belief, they do play games. I already listed a few by going through that list. SteamDB has a list of Linux games if you want to have a look, and because of this, Linux OS has been given a new lease of life for a lot of PC gamers, including myself, who either don't want to install Windows because Macs was the only other option they had, or they're concerned about Windows 10 and their own privacy. I've mentioned this before, but you can turn these settings off via toggles or registry edits in Windows itself, but the fact that you have to go through rooting around in the registry to turn those off is sometimes enough for people to jump ship, sometimes even to a Mac, let alone Linux. It's not perfect, it's not designed to be like that. I'll be the first person to admit that the drivers on AMD's side, at least for gaming, have not been very good for, well, anything really. The Catalyst Radeon settings don't really support modern features like VSR or HDMI 2 properly, but at least it's there, which is all I can say about it really. It's just sort of there. With every delayed update to Radeon settings, there are some performance improvements most of the time, and I can guess that it's the same for Nvidia too, probably a little bit better. You can argue, quite rightly, that performance across the board for Linux is not as good as Windows, but that isn't the point right now. Right now, resources for Linux ports are all focused on the feature set Linux has to offer, such as a smaller graphics overhead and eventually running on Vulkan. That's no mean feat. I said a similar thing before on Reddit about how you get a potential audience to buy a smartphone in developing countries such as India. This analogy actually applies pretty well to this situation, as I go on to this say that in order to make sure there's an audience who want the thing that you're selling, you sell them watered down versions of the thing you're selling to give them the limited experience of what you will sell them. It's similar to what Apple is doing with the iPhone 6 SE, which is essentially an iPhone 6 and an iPhone 5S shell with a 4-inch display that can edit 4K video. That's not a bad thing. Samsung phones have made huge waves in India as they're generally quite cheap for what they offer, even over here in Europe and America, for similar reasons. They're not going to compete with the S7, but like games getting Linux ports, that was not the idea. It was to grow the audience, a potential audience. You need to test the water before you try to make your ideas float, as they could sink. It hasn't, but it could have done. The same is true for porting games over for Linux, or even Mac OS actually. In order to find out if there's a marketplace for Linux gaming, Valve introduced Steam for Linux in 2012 and decided to open the store up to developers so anyone who can code can sell a Linux port, assuming they know how to. At the time, the client was in a beta, and this beta went so well that the client is permanently out of a beta, save for the other optional beta that they have even on Windows, and is updated alongside Windows. That's all good. A lot of indie devs, and notably 2K Games, saw opportunities to expand to different platforms, with one of the first AAA games for Linux, which was BioShock Infinite, a good game in anyone's book, being the first AAA game to come out that was pretty recent. It isn't technically a native port, it uses a wrapper called Eon to make itself run on Linux, but still. BioShock on Linux is still a good thing to see. This prompted the Borderlands pre-sequel to get support, as well as Borderlands 2, Saints Row 4, which also got an Eon-wrapped Linux port, and then a company comes along to rival Eon's porting games to Linux. That company are the gods that are commonly known as Feral Interactive. They're responsible for the XCOM 2 and XCOM Enemy Unknown ports, with XCOM 2 reportedly running better on Nvidia hardware on Linux than its Windows counterpart. That's how good they are at Linux ports. Though they have been on the other end of that spectrum too, with their Mac and Linux port of Alien Isolation, running horribly on AMD hardware and fantastically on Nvidia hardware on the same platform. kind of ruins my point a little bit, doesn't it? Want more proof? Payday 2, from my experience, runs just as well as it does on Windows as it does on Linux, and that's saying a lot to the game. Overall, it runs like arse 90% of the time on Windows. Take that as a compliment, overkill, as the words good performance and Payday 2 are never normally in the same sentence. Feral Interactive, as well as the other companies I've listed, have proven that Linux ports are worthwhile and are doable for the most part, and that they are beneficial to the overall gaming market. I firmly believe that Linux does have its place in PC gaming, even if it is for only like 5% of the market. That 5% is still a lot of people, so don't write off that number so quickly, journalists and bloggers, because I've just given you respectably good games got multi-platform port. That's all I have to say. Just pretend I dropped a mic. And with that, I thank you very much for listening. They're responsible for the XCOM 2 and XCOM 2 Enemy Unknown, when people are outraged that a certain game got a Linux port, but not a Mac port. Oh goodness. They're responsible for the XCOM 2 and the others developed like CG Project. That's a hard one to say.